December the 3rd, 1944. A makeshift field hospital near the Caledon Valley, Burma. The monsoon rains had finally ceased, leaving the jungle floor a treacherous mix of mud and rotting vegetation. Captain James Morrison of the United States Army Medical Corps sat in a canvas tent reviewing casualty reports from the previous week's engagement against Japanese forces. The numbers were devastating. His unit had treated 247 wounded soldiers in just 5 days, performing surgeries under conditions that would have been considered barbaric in any stateside hospital. But it was not the volume of casualties that troubled Morrison as he studied the reports that evening. It was a pattern he had noticed over the past 6 months, a pattern that contradicted everything he thought he understood about the war in Southeast Asia. Morrison's field hospitals had treated 4,127 West African soldiers since June 1944. That was more than the number of British troops treated during the same period, despite official records indicating there were fewer West African units in the sector. The wounds these African soldiers presented were consistent with heavy combat, gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, tropical diseases exacerbated by exhaustion and malnutrition. These were not men performing auxiliary roles. These were combat infantry who had been in sustained contact with Japanese forces for extended periods. When Morrison mentioned this observation to fellow American officers, their responses were uniformly dismissive or confused. Most American personnel in the China-Burma-India theater had no idea there were African troops fighting in Burma at all. When Morrison explained that entire divisions of Nigerian, Gold Coast, and Gambian soldiers were engaged in some of the campaign's most difficult operations, his colleagues assumed he was referring to laborers or transport units. The concept that African soldiers were serving as frontline combat infantry, fighting and dying in the same battles as British, American, and Chinese troops, simply did not register. Yet, in December 1944, most Americans, including senior military officers, war correspondents, and certainly the American public, had never heard of these African troops. They did not appear in American newspaper accounts of the Burma campaign. They were rarely mentioned in official American military reports. When American soldiers returned home and told stories of fighting in the China-Burma-India theater, they spoke of British troops, of Merrill's Marauders, of Chinese divisions, of the Flying Tigers. The African soldiers who had fought beside them, who had held defensive positions that protected American supply lines, who had participated in the same battles and died in the same jungles, were simply absent from the American narrative of the war. This was not accidental erasure or deliberate suppression of information. It was something more subtle and perhaps more revealing about how Americans understood the world in the 1940s. The presence of African combat troops in a major theater of World War II contradicted fundamental assumptions that most Americans held about race, about military capability, about who could be trusted with modern weapons and the responsibilities of combat. The American military itself was rigidly segregated in 1944, with African American troops largely relegated to support roles in labor battalions. The few African American combat units that did see action, like the Tuskegee Airmen or the 92nd Infantry Division in Italy, faced constant skepticism about their capabilities and had to prove themselves repeatedly against prejudices that assumed black soldiers were inherently inferior. Into this context came information that would have been cognitively dissonant for most Americans. Not only were there African combat troops fighting in Burma, but they were performing effectively in some of the war's most demanding operations. British commanders, whatever their own racial prejudices might have been, had concluded through hard experience that West African troops were exceptionally well suited for jungle warfare and could be deployed in frontline combat roles with confidence. This conclusion was based not on progressive racial attitudes, but on desperate military necessity and subsequent battlefield performance that could not be ignored. The Hidden Army. The truth that Captain Morrison was documenting in his medical records represented a massive gap in American understanding of the war effort. Over 500,000 African soldiers served in British colonial forces during World War II. Approximately 200,000 of these troops fought in the Burma campaign between 1942 and 1945, facing Japanese forces in jungle warfare conditions that military historians would later describe as among the most challenging of the entire war. These African divisions participated in every major operation in Burma after 1943: the defense of India's northeastern frontier, the battles at Kohima and Imphal, operations in the Arakan along the Chindit River, down the length of Burma to the Thai border. They suffered casualty rates comparable to or exceeding those of other Allied units, with some West African brigades experiencing 40% casualties during sustained operations. The Royal West African Frontier Force, established in the late 19th century as a colonial policing organization, began rapid expansion in 1940. Recruiting stations opened across British West Africa, Nigeria, Gold Coast, modern Ghana, Gambia. Young men enlisted for various reasons: economic opportunity in colonies where cash employment was scarce, military tradition in societies where service carried social prestige, desire for adventure, pressure from colonial authorities who imposed informal recruitment quotas on local chiefs. The expansion was extraordinary in scale and speed. In 1939, the Royal West African Frontier Force numbered approximately 8,000 men, primarily engaged in internal security duties across 4 separate colonies. By 1945, West African military forces had expanded to over 176,000 soldiers organized into multiple divisions and independent brigades. This represented one of the largest military mobilizations in African history, accomplished in societies with limited industrial infrastructure and where military traditions were often suppressed or redirected by colonial authorities. Private Ahmadu Bello, a Nigerian soldier from Kano who enlisted in 1941, kept a diary during his transport to India in late 1942. His entries, preserved in the Imperial War Museum archives, provide rare first-hand documentation of the African soldier's experience. Bello wrote in English, learned through missionary schools in northern Nigeria. He described the cramped conditions below deck, where soldiers slept in shifts due to lack of space. He wrote about the heat which made the lower decks almost uninhabitable during daylight hours. He documented the deaths from disease, soldiers who sickened during the voyage and were buried at sea with minimal ceremony. He expressed anxiety about the war he was sailing toward, about the Japanese enemy he had heard described as fierce and numerous, about whether he would ever see his family again. The West African divisions arrived in India in late 1942 and early 1943. Moving to staging areas where final preparations for combat operations were conducted. British commanders in the India-Burma theater, desperate for reliable combat troops, watched these West African units with a mixture of hope and skepticism. Major General William Slim, commanding the British 14th Army that would eventually conduct the reconquest of Burma, initially shared the common British prejudices about the reliability of colonial troops. Could they really perform in sustained combat against Japanese forces that had proven themselves superior to British troops in jungle warfare? The answer came in the Arakan campaign of late 1942 and early 1943, a British offensive into coastal Burma. The 81st West African Division participated in this offensive, their first sustained combat against Japanese forces. The campaign was a disaster in military terms. British forces advanced into difficult terrain without adequate supplies or air support, and Japanese counterattacks drove them back with heavy losses. But within this overall failure, the performance of West African troops was noteworthy and began to change British assessments. Colonel Hugh Stockwell, commanding a brigade that included West African battalions, filed reports documenting their performance under conditions that had broken other British units. When Japanese forces infiltrated behind British lines, a common tactic that had proven devastatingly effective in earlier campaigns, West African troops did not panic. They held defensive positions, conducted effective patrolling despite operating in terrain that favored the Japanese, and maintained unit cohesion even when supply lines were cut. More significantly, West African troops demonstrated superior tolerance for the jungle environment that had proven so debilitating to British forces. Malaria, dysentery, scrub typhus, and numerous other tropical diseases had caused more British casualties in Burma than combat itself. British soldiers fell ill at alarming rates, requiring evacuation to rear areas and consuming medical resources that were already inadequate. West African soldiers also contracted tropical diseases, but at substantially lower rates, and they often remained combat effective, even when dealing with illnesses that would have hospitalized British troops. The medical statistics from the Arakan campaign were striking. British combat units in Burma typically experienced 60 to 70% casualty rates from disease alone during the monsoon season. West African units experienced disease casualty rates of 30 to 40%, still devastating but significantly lower. This meant that West African divisions could maintain combat effectiveness through conditions that rendered British divisions non-operational. For commanders desperate to maintain forces in contact with the enemy, this difference was strategically significant. General Slim, reviewing reports from the Arakan campaign, reached a conclusion that would shape British strategy for the remainder of the Burma campaign. West African troops were not auxiliary forces to be used in secondary roles. They were potentially the most reliable combat infantry available for jungle warfare. Slim was a practical commander. Whatever his personal racial attitudes might have been, he cared primarily about battlefield effectiveness. The most significant battles in which West African troops played crucial roles occurred during 1944, when Allied forces in Burma transitioned from defensive operations to sustained offensives. The Battle of Kohima and Imphal, fought from March to July 1944, represented the climax of the Burma campaign and one of the pivotal battles of the entire Pacific War. Japanese forces launched Operation U-Go, an offensive aimed at breaking into India itself, invading through the mountainous jungle terrain of Manipur and Nagaland. The battle was desperate and brutal. Japanese forces fought with the fanatical determination that characterized their military culture. British and Indian forces defending Kohima and Imphal found themselves surrounded and besieged, dependent on air supply to hold positions until relief columns could break through. The fighting lasted 4 months, much of it hand-to-hand combat in conditions that tested the limits of human endurance. Monsoon rains turned battlefields into swamps. Disease ravaged both sides. Supply shortages led to starvation among Japanese troops and severe hardship among the defenders. West African divisions participated throughout this battle, though their contribution was largely absent from American accounts of the fighting. The 81st West African Division fought in the Culloden Valley, conducting operations that tied down Japanese forces and prevented them from reinforcing the main assault on Imphal. The 82nd West African Division participated in the relief of Imphal, fighting through Japanese positions along the Imphal-Kohima road. These were not secondary operations. They were essential components of the overall battle, and West African casualties reflected the intensity of the combat. The 81st Division alone suffered over 3,400 casualties during the 1944 fighting, including 580 killed in action. Yet when American newspapers reported on the Battle of Imphal, they described it as a British and Indian victory, sometimes mentioning Chinese forces operating in northern Burma, but almost never acknowledging the presence of African troops. When American military analysts studied the battle, Their reports focused on British and Indian divisions, on American air support that had supplied the besieged garrisons, on the tactical and strategic implications for future operations. West African divisions were invisible in these American analyses, present in the battle but absent from American understanding of it. What received even less attention was that West African troops participated extensively in long-range penetration operations behind Japanese lines. The British had developed a specialized force concept called Chindits, long-range penetration groups that operated deep behind enemy lines, supplied by air, conducting raids and reconnaissance. The 3rd West African Brigade was specifically trained for long-range penetration, operating in small columns that moved through Japanese-controlled territory conducting reconnaissance, ambushing supply convoys, and disrupting communications. These operations required exceptional discipline and physical endurance. Soldiers carried everything they needed on their backs, operating for weeks without resupply except for occasional airdrops. They moved through terrain that was barely mapped, navigating by compass and dead reckoning. They engaged Japanese patrols in brief, violent encounters before melting back into the jungle. The 3rd West African Brigade operated behind Japanese lines for extended periods in 1944 and 1945, conducting operations that British commanders considered successful, but that American records barely mentioned. Lieutenant James Baldwin, an African-American pilot, flying C-47 transport aircraft in the India-Burma theater, wrote in his private letters about the cognitive dissonance he experienced when he eventually learned about West African combat troops. Baldwin flew supply missions throughout 1944, dropping equipment and supplies to various Allied forces operating in Burma. He encountered segregation and discrimination as an African-American officer, assigned to all-black units and barred from facilities reserved for white officers. The U.S. military's racial policies in 1944 were explicitly based on assumptions about the inferiority of black soldiers and their unsuitability for roles requiring intelligence and initiative. When Baldwin learned, through conversation with a British liaison officer, that he had been supplying African combat troops who were conducting operations behind enemy lines, the contradiction was profound and disturbing. Baldwin noted in a letter to his brother, "We are told we cannot be trusted with combat roles that require thinking." Meanwhile, African soldiers from Nigeria are conducting raids behind enemy lines that require more initiative than most white American infantry ever show. How does this make sense? The scale of West African casualties in Burma provided undeniable evidence of their combat role, though this evidence was not widely known in America at the time. Approximately 200,000 West African troops served in the Burma campaign between 1942 and 1945. Of these, over 9,000 were killed in action, and more than 30,000 were wounded. The casualty rate of approximately 20% over 3 years of sustained combat was comparable to that of British and Indian divisions in the same theater. These were not the casualty figures of support troops or labor battalions. These were combat infantry casualties, reflecting sustained engagement with enemy forces under the most difficult conditions. The cemetery records from Burma war graves provide stark documentation of this sacrifice. The Taukian War Cemetery outside Rangoon contains graves of 6,374 Commonwealth soldiers killed in Burma, including over 1,100 West African troops. These graves represent young men from Nigeria, Gold Coast, and Gambia, who died thousands of miles from home in a war that most of their communities barely understood. They died fighting an enemy they had no personal quarrel with, in service of a colonial power that denied them political rights and economic opportunities for a cause, the defeat of fascism and Japanese militarism, that was presented as defending freedom and democracy, even as those ideals were denied to colonial subjects. When the Burma campaign ended in May 1945 with the Allied recapture of Rangoon, West African divisions had been in continuous combat for nearly 3 years. They had participated in every major operation, fought in every region of Burma, demonstrated effectiveness in every type of operation, from defensive battles to offensive assaults to specialized long-range penetration raids. British commanders acknowledged their contributions, though this acknowledgement rarely translated to meaningful post-war benefits. General Slim noted in his memoirs that West African troops had proven themselves first-class jungle fighters whose contributions were essential to our success. The veteran West African soldiers who survived Burma and returned to West Africa in 1945 and 1946 found their service undervalued and their contributions marginalized not only in American consciousness, but also within the British Empire they had served. They were demobilized rapidly with minimal benefits, far less generous than those provided to British or American veterans. Many returned to colonial societies where their military experience and expectations for recognition clashed with colonial authorities determined to maintain pre-war racial hierarchies. Private Ahmadu Bello, whose diary documented the journey to Burma in 1942, survived the war and returned to Nigeria in 1946. His later diary entries reflected on his service with a mixture of pride and bitterness. Pride in what he and his fellow soldiers had accomplished in the battles they had won, in the comrades they had lost, in the capability they had demonstrated. Bitterness at how their service was forgotten or dismissed, at how colonial rule continued unchanged despite African soldiers having fought for Allied victory. Bello wrote in 1947, "We fought for Britain in their war against Japan. We showed we could fight as well as any British soldier. We died in their thousands. And now we return to Nigeria, where we are still subjects with no rights, where white men still rule us and take our resources. What did we fight for? The Gold Coast riots of 1948, a watershed moment in West African decolonization, were triggered partly by a peaceful march of ex-servicemen demanding better treatment and recognition of their wartime service. When colonial police fired on the marchers, killing 3 veterans, the incident sparked broader unrest that eventually accelerated the process of decolonization. The irony was bitter. Men who had fought for the British Empire against fascism were shot by colonial police for demanding basic respect and economic justice. American awareness of West African contributions to World War II remained essentially zero for decades after the war. When African colonies began achieving independence in the late 1950s and 1960s, American news coverage typically portrayed this as a sudden emergence of African nationalism driven by charismatic leaders. The deeper historical roots of this nationalism, including the role of World War II veterans who had experienced both military service and post-war disillusionment, were rarely explored in American media or scholarship. This historical amnesia was not unique to West African troops. American understanding of World War II has consistently marginalized or erased the contributions of non-white combatants across multiple theaters. The Indian Army, which fielded over 2.5 million soldiers during the war and fought in Africa, the Middle East, and Asia, was similarly absent from most American accounts. Chinese military contributions, despite China suffering more casualties than any nation except the Soviet Union, were often reduced in American narratives to the Flying Tigers and occasional mention of Chinese forces in Burma. But the erasure of African contributions had particular significance because it reinforced racial assumptions that shaped American society. The absence of African combatants from American narratives of the war supported the implicit claim that World War II was primarily a conflict of white nations, with non-white peoples playing supporting roles at best. This narrative aligned comfortably with American racial hierarchies and made the war usable as a founding myth for American global power without confronting the contradiction between fighting for freedom and democracy while maintaining racial segregation at home and supporting colonial rule abroad. The few American military analysts who studied British colonial military forces often reached conclusions that reflected American racial assumptions rather than objective assessment of British experience. A U.S. Army analysis of British colonial forces prepared in 1944 acknowledged that West African troops had performed acceptably in Burma, but attributed this primarily to British leadership and close supervision. The report suggested that West African troops required high ratios of British officers to African soldiers, that they were suited primarily for operations in tropical environments, and that their performance demonstrated the necessity of careful selection and extensive training rather than challenging assumptions about racial capabilities. The actual ratios of British officers to West African soldiers contradicted the American report's assumptions. West African battalions typically operated with 20 to 30 British officers and senior NCOs commanding approximately 800 African soldiers, a ratio of roughly 1:30. This was higher than the officer-to-soldier ratio in British regular battalions, but substantially lower than American military doctrine suggested would be necessary for black troops. The British experience suggested that African soldiers could operate effectively with modest European supervision, but this lesson was not incorporated into American military policy. The question of why American military institutions failed to learn from British experience with West African troops has multiple answers, none flattering to American military leadership. First, there was simple prejudice. American military culture in the 1940s was deeply racist, reflecting broader American society. Many senior American officers genuinely believed in black inferiority and interpreted evidence through this prejudice. Second, institutional inertia made changing racial policies difficult even when evidence suggested change was justified. The U.S. military had committed to segregation as official policy, and reversing this policy would have required admitting error, disrupting established practices, and confronting political opposition from segregationist politicians. But perhaps the deepest reason for American failure to engage with the implications of West African military service was that doing so would have required confronting fundamental contradictions in how Americans understood the war. World War II was presented to Americans as a fight for freedom and democracy against fascism and militarism. This narrative required emphasizing American values and downplaying the contradictions between these values and American racial policies. Acknowledging that colonized African soldiers were fighting effectively for Allied victory would have raised uncomfortable questions. If Africans could fight for freedom, why were they denied freedom in their own societies? If black soldiers could perform in demanding combat roles, what justified denying these roles to African Americans? If the war was about democracy and self-determination, why were colonial empires being preserved and even strengthened through the war effort? The marginalization of West African contributions to the war effort fit within this broader pattern of narrative simplification. Including West African soldiers in American understanding of the war would have complicated the simple story of democratic nations defeating fascism. It would have required acknowledging that Allied victory depended significantly on colonized peoples whose political status contradicted Allied rhetoric. It would have required confronting the fact that British colonial forces employed African soldiers in combat roles, that American military policy claimed black soldiers were incapable of performing. Captain Morrison's medical records from Burma, carefully documenting the treatment of thousands of West African soldiers, represented one small window into this larger story. His observations that West African troops were bearing substantial combat burdens, that their casualties reflected intensive frontline fighting, that their physical and psychological resilience exceeded that of many other troops. These observations were accurate and significant. They contradicted American assumptions about black soldiers' capabilities. They provided evidence that should have informed American military policy and public understanding. Instead, they were filed away, noted by one American medical officer, but never incorporated into broader American consciousness. Morrison survived the war and returned to a medical practice in Ohio, where he occasionally spoke about his experiences in Burma. In conversations with fellow veterans and in a few newspaper interviews over the years, he mentioned the West African soldiers he had treated, their courage under terrible conditions, his respect for their capabilities. But these mentions were brief and attracted little attention. The notebooks Morrison kept, with their careful statistics on West African casualties and his observations about their performance, were donated to a military medical archive after his death in 1978. They sit there still, containing evidence of a contribution that most Americans remain unaware of. In recent decades, increased scholarly attention to colonial military forces and the contributions of non-white combatants to World Wars I and the Somme has begun to correct some of these historical gaps. British historians have produced comprehensive studies of West African military service. African historians have explored how World War II service influenced anti-colonial movements and shaped African nationalism. Military historians studying the Burma campaign have given increased attention to the role of West African divisions in Allied operations. But this scholarship has largely remained within academic circles. Popular American understanding of World War II continues to be shaped primarily by older narratives that marginalize or exclude West African contributions. American films about World War II rarely depict African soldiers. American museums and memorials commemorating the war give minimal attention to colonial military forces. American textbooks covering World War II typically mention West African troops briefly, if at all. The evidence remains in archival records, in casualty statistics, in cemetery graves, in the few memoirs and oral histories that survived. The evidence documents a contribution that was real, substantial, and historically significant, regardless of whether it was acknowledged or remembered. West African soldiers fought in Burma. They fought effectively. They paid a terrible price. Over 200,000 served. More than 9,000 died. Over 30,000 were wounded. They participated in every major battle from 1943 to 1945. They held the line at Kohima and Imphal. They conducted long-range raids behind enemy lines. They endured conditions that broke other units. They demonstrated capabilities that contradicted racial assumptions prevalent in both America and Britain. What Americans never knew about their African allies in World War II was not trivial detail or academic minutiae. It was fundamental reality about who fought the war, how victory was achieved, and what the war revealed about human capabilities across racial and cultural boundaries. The ignorance was not innocent oversight, but structured blindness, a failure to see what contradicted preferred narratives and comfortable assumptions. 8 decades after Captain Morrison sat in his Burma field hospital reviewing casualty reports and noticing patterns that troubled him, after Private Ahmadu Bello wrote in his diary about the contradictions between fighting for freedom while remaining a colonial subject, after West African soldiers fought and died in jungles thousands of miles from home, defending causes that often excluded them, the historical accounting remains incomplete. American understanding of World War II still largely excludes these contributions. American narratives of the war still center American and European participants while marginalizing others. The West African soldiers who fought in Burma did not fight for recognition or historical memory. They fought because they were ordered to fight, because military service created its own imperatives, because courage and loyalty to comrades transcended the political circumstances that brought them to battle. But they deserved recognition nonetheless, deserved to be remembered and honored, deserved to have their contributions acknowledged and their sacrifices commemorated. That this recognition came late, if it came at all, that their story remained largely unknown to the Americans who were their allies in the war against fascism and militarism, represents a failure not of the soldiers who served, but of the societies and institutions that chose not to see them. The final truth, documented in Captain Morrison's medical notebooks and in British military records and in the graves scattered across Burma and India, is simply this. Over 200,000 West African soldiers fought in the Burma campaign between 1942 and 1945. They served as frontline combat infantry in one of the war's most difficult theaters. They suffered more than 9,000 killed and 30,000 wounded. They participated in decisive battles including Kohima, Imphal, and the final drive to Rangoon. They demonstrated military capabilities that contradicted racial assumptions prevalent in both America and Britain. They contributed significantly to Allied victory in Southeast Asia. And they did all this while remaining almost completely unknown to the American public, invisible in American narratives of the war, absent from American historical memory despite being allies in the struggle against Japanese militarism. What Americans never knew about their African allies in World War II could fill volumes. What they should have known, what they needed to know to understand the war accurately and to confront their own racial assumptions honestly, could be summarized simply. African soldiers fought, suffered, sacrificed, and contributed to Allied victory in ways that deserved recognition they never received. 8 decades later, that recognition remains overdue, a debt of historical justice not yet paid, a gap in understanding not yet filled. The soldiers are gone now. The last West African veterans of Burma died years ago. But their story remains, waiting to be told, waiting to be acknowledged, waiting to claim its rightful place in the history of World War II and in American understanding of that history. If this documentary resonated with you, please like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below.